There is a signal that has been sitting in the archaeological record for thousands of years. Not a metaphorical signal. Not the kind of signal that requires creative interpretation or willingness to abandon critical thinking. A literal, documented, measurable signal encoded in stone, in mathematics, in astronomical alignments, in the consistent testimony of dozens of ancient civilizations that had no known contact with each other and yet left behind the same information, in the same form, pointing at the same coordinates in the sky. Someone sent a message. The question that serious researchers have been asking for decades and that mainstream academia has spent equal energy trying not to ask is who sent it, when they sent it, and whether anyone receiving it has understood what it says. Tonight we are going to look at that question directly, not through the lens of television entertainment or the soft focus of speculative documentary filmmaking, through the evidence itself, through the specific, measurable, documented details that sit in the archaeological record waiting for someone to look at them without the comfortable assumption that human civilization began approximately 5,000 years ago and developed in a straight, uninterrupted line, from stone tools to smartphones. That assumption has a problem. The problem is the evidence. We begin with a signal that was not sent to us through stone or architecture but through radio waves. On August 15, 1977, a volunteer astronomer named Jerry Ehrman was reviewing data from the Big Ear radio telescope at Ohio State University when he noticed something in the printout that stopped him completely. A signal had been received the previous night that bore all the characteristics that researchers in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence had theorized an artificial signal from deep space would carry. It was narrowband concentrated in a specific frequency rather than spread across the spectrum the way natural radio sources are. It was at the hydrogen line frequency 1420 MHz, which SETI researchers had long theorized would be the universal frequency chosen for interstellar communication, because hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe and any technologically advanced civilization would know it. It lasted for exactly 72 seconds, the maximum duration that the Big Ear telescope could observe any point in the sky given Earth's rotation. Jerry Ehrman circled the signal on the printout and wrote one word beside it. Wow! The wow signal, as it has been known ever since, has never been explained. It has never been received again despite decades of subsequent observation. Every natural explanation that has been proposed, interference from a satellite, a reflection from space debris, a misidentified terrestrial signal has been examined and ruled out. In 2016, a team of researchers proposed that the signal might have originated from a hydrogen cloud surrounding two comets that were in the field of view on the night of August 15, 1977. The scientific community's response was cautious. Hydrogen clouds surrounding comets do not typically produce narrowband signals at exactly the hydrogen line frequency with the intensity profile that the WOW signal displayed. The WOW signal remains the strongest candidate for an artificial extraterrestrial transmission ever recorded. It remains unconfirmed. It remains unexplained. And it came from the direction of the constellation Sagittarius, a direction that, as we will see, appears in the archaeological record of ancient civilizations with a frequency that is difficult to attribute to coincidence. We now move from the radio telescope to the desert, to a series of lines drawn in the surface of the Nazca Plateau in southern Peru that represent one of the most enduring and genuinely puzzling archaeological mysteries of the 20th century. The Nazca Lines were created by the Nazca culture of ancient Peru between approximately 500 BCE and 500 CE. They cover an area of approximately 500 square kilometers of high desert plateau. They depict animals like a hummingbird, a spider, a monkey, a condor geometric shapes, and straight lines that extend for miles across the plateau with an accuracy that modern surveyors who have examined them find impressive. Some of the lines are perfectly straight for distances of up to 48 kilometers across terrain that is not flat. The figures are drawn at a scale that makes them visible and comprehensible only from the air. From ground level, they are largely incomprehensible. From a significant altitude, they are clearly and intentionally representational. The conventional explanation is that the lines were created for religious or ceremonial purposes, perhaps as offerings to the gods, perhaps as part of water ritual, perhaps as astronomical markers. All of these explanations are plausible. None of them explain why a civilization without flight would invest the engineering effort required to create figures that can only be fully appreciated from an aerial perspective. The ancient alien hypothesis proposes that the Nazca Lines were created as landing markers or communication symbols directed at visitors from the sky, a hypothesis that is not evidence-based in any direct sense, but that addresses a genuine gap in the conventional explanation. Why create art that you cannot see? What is most interesting about the Nazca lines for our purposes tonight is not the lines themselves but the spider. The Nazca spider figure, one of the most precisely drawn of all the geoglyphs, has been identified by arachnologists as a representation of a spider of the genus Riciniulae, a rare spider that lives exclusively in remote areas of the Amazon rainforest, a region far from the Nazca Plateau and largely inaccessible to the ancient Nazca people. The spider is depicted with an extended appendage that is a reproductive organ visible only under microscopic examination, an anatomical detail that is impossible to observe with the naked eye. How did the Nazca people create a precise representation of a spider they likely never saw, including a microscopically small anatomical feature they could not have observed without magnification? The conventional explanation is that the Nazca people had more contact with the Amazon than we have assumed. This is possible. It does not explain the microscopic anatomical detail. We turn now to a connection that spans 3 continents and 4,000 years, a connection that sits in the mathematical language of ancient architecture and has been documented by researchers across multiple independent fields of study. The number phi, the golden ratio, approximately 1.618, appears in the proportions of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It appears in the proportions of the Parthenon in Athens. It appears in the design of the Chartres Cathedral in France. It appears in the layout of ancient Mesoamerican temples. It appears in the spiral of the Nautilus shell, in the branching pattern of trees, in the proportions of the human body, in the structure of DNA. This is not a coincidence. This is the fundamental mathematical structure of growth and form in the natural world, a ratio so deeply embedded in the physics of how matter organizes itself that it appears at every scale of the observable universe. Ancient architects who encoded phi into their buildings were not independently inventing an abstract mathematical concept. They were recognizing and reproducing a pattern they observed in nature. But here's where it becomes interesting. The consistent appearance of phi across ancient cultures that had no known contact with Egypt, Greece, Mesoamerica, ancient India suggests either that multiple independent civilizations separately discovered the same mathematical principle through observation of nature, or that they shared a common source for this knowledge. A source that transmitted the same mathematical understanding to cultures separated by oceans and millennia. What that source was, the conventional record does not identify. This is Grimvale Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video, don't miss what rises next from the darkness. We move from mathematics to mythology, to the most consistent story that ancient human civilization tells about itself across every culture that has ever been studied. Every major ancient civilization has a flood myth. This is among the most documented observations in comparative mythology. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh describes a great flood sent by the gods, survived by a single righteous man who was warned in advance and built a vessel to survive it. The Hebrew book of Genesis describes the same event, with the same basic structure, in slightly different detail. The ancient Indian Matsya Purana describes a flood survived by the first man Manu, warned by a divine fish. Ancient Chinese mythology describes a great flood controlled by the hero Gun and his son Yu. The ancient Greeks described Deucalion surviving a flood sent by Zeus. The Maya described a flood that destroyed a previous version of humanity. The Hopi describe a flood that ended a previous world. Aboriginal Australian traditions describe a great inundation of the land. These myths are not copies of each other. They arise from cultures that had no documented contact and are embedded in mythological frameworks that are otherwise entirely distinct. Yet they share the same core event, a catastrophic global flood, a divine warning to a specific individual or group, survival through deliberate preparation, and the repopulation of the world afterward. The ancient alien interpretation of this cross-cultural consistency proposes that the flood myths record an actual catastrophic event, possibly the rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, approximately 11,700 years ago, and that the consistent detail of a divine warning suggests an intelligence that communicated the coming catastrophe to human populations before it occurred. The scientific reality is that sea levels did rise dramatically at the end of the last ice age, flooding vast areas of inhabited coastal land. This is not disputed. What is disputed is the ancient alien component, the idea that the warning described in every flood myth reflects actual communication from a non-human intelligence. What is not disputed is the consistency of the myths themselves, and that consistency points at something that happened, to someone, that was real enough to survive in the foundational stories of every major human civilization. We turn now to the stars themselves, to a specific astronomical knowledge that appears in ancient cultures with a precision that has never been fully explained by the conventional timeline of human observation. The Dogon people of Mali, West Africa, have been studied extensively since the 1930s when French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germain Dieterlen documented their astronomical knowledge in detail. The Dogon possessed detailed knowledge of the Sirius star system, knowledge that included the existence of Sirius B, a white dwarf companion star to Sirius that is invisible to the naked eye and was not confirmed by Western astronomy until 1862, with photographic evidence not obtained until 1970. The Dogon knew that Sirius B existed. They knew its orbital period around Sirius, approximately 50 years. They knew it was extremely dense and small. They described it as the heaviest star in the sky. They also possessed knowledge of the rings of Saturn and the 4 major moons of Jupiter, observations that require a telescope to make. The conventional explanation for the Dogon's knowledge of Sirius B is that it was contaminated, that the Dogon learned about Sirius B from contact with Western astronomers before Griaule's study was conducted, and that the apparent antiquity of the knowledge is a result of how recently acquired information was integrated into existing mythological frameworks. This explanation has been advanced seriously by anthropologists who challenge Griaule's methodology. What it does not explain is the broader pattern, the Dogon's knowledge of Saturn's rings, of Jupiter's moons, of the rotation of the Earth, of the heliocentrism of the solar system. Knowledge that is not easily attributable to casual contact with 19th-century Western astronomers. The ancient alien interpretation is that the Dogon's astronomical knowledge was transmitted directly by visitors from the Sirius system, an interpretation that the Dogon's own mythology supports, describing the Nommo, amphibious beings who came from Sirius and brought knowledge to humanity. This interpretation requires accepting a great deal that is not evidence-based. But the knowledge itself, the Dogon's accurate description of Sirius B's properties and orbital period, remains documented and remains without a fully satisfying conventional explanation. We arrive now at the most precisely documented and most technically specific piece of evidence in the ancient alien discussion, an artifact that has been examined by engineers, archaeologists, and historians, and that has not been convincingly explained within the conventional framework of ancient technological development. The Antikythera Mechanism was recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. It dates to approximately 100 BCE. It is a mechanical computing device, a bronze-geared mechanism of extraordinary complexity designed to predict astronomical events. It could calculate the position of the sun and moon, predict solar and lunar eclipses, track the Fourier cycle of the Olympic Games, and display the position of the known planets. It contained at least 30 interlocking gears machined to tolerances that were not achieved again in Europe until the development of mechanical clockmaking in the 14th century CE. Nothing like it appears in the archaeological record before its construction. Nothing like it appears for over 1,000 years after it. It represents a technological singularity, a device whose sophistication is so far beyond what the conventional history of technology would predict for its time and place that its existence requires explanation. The conventional explanation is that the Antikythera Mechanism represents the pinnacle of a Greek mechanical tradition that was subsequently lost, destroyed by the sacking of libraries and workshops, interrupted by political and military catastrophe, and never successfully reconstructed. This explanation is archaeologically reasonable and historically plausible. It is also an explanation for why the technology disappeared, not an explanation for how it appeared in the first place. The ancient alien hypothesis proposes that the Antikythera Mechanism represents human attempts to replicate or document technology encountered from an external source, that its sophistication reflects knowledge that was not independently developed but transmitted. This is not demonstrable from the artifact itself, but the artifact's existence as a singular exception to the conventional technological timeline of human history is a documented fact that the conventional explanation acknowledges without fully resolving. This is Grimvale Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video, don't miss what rises next from the darkness. We come to the final and perhaps most profound piece of the puzzle, a piece that sits not in the desert or the observatory or the archaeological museum, but in the oldest texts that human civilization has produced. The Vedic texts of ancient India, among the oldest written documents in human history, dating in their oral tradition to at least 1500 BCE and possibly much earlier, contain descriptions of flying vehicles called Vimanas. These are not metaphorical descriptions. The Vaimanika Shastra, a text that purports to describe the construction and operation of Vimanas, contains technical specifications, descriptions of materials, fuel types, operational procedures that have been examined by aerospace engineers who have found some of the descriptions consistent with principles of aerodynamics, even if the specific implementations described are not always technically coherent. The ancient Indian epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, contain descriptions of aerial warfare, of weapons that produce effects consistent with nuclear or thermonuclear detonations, of divine beings descending from the sky in vehicles of fire, of cities in the sky. These descriptions are embedded in texts that are simultaneously sophisticated philosophical and literary documents, not the work of primitive imaginations but of a civilization of genuine intellectual depth. The ancient Sumerian texts, the oldest written documents yet discovered, describe the Anunnaki, divine beings who descended from the sky, who created humanity through a process that the texts describe in terms that some researchers have compared to genetic engineering, who taught humanity agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and law, and who eventually departed. The ancient Egyptian texts describe the Neteru, divine beings associated with specific stars and star systems who brought the knowledge of civilization to humanity at the beginning of the historical record. The ancient Mesoamerican traditions describe Quetzalcoatl, a feathered serpent deity who arrived from the sky, taught humanity the arts of civilization, and promised to return. These are not the same stories told by different cultures. They are different stories that converge on the same fundamental description. Beings from the sky brought knowledge to humanity at the beginning of recorded history, and humanity has been trying to make sense of that encounter ever since. Whether those beings were literally extraterrestrial beings from another star system, making deliberate contact with alien human civilization, or whether they represent something else entirely, a pre-existing human civilization of greater sophistication than conventional history acknowledges, or a natural phenomenon interpreted through the mythological framework of the cultures that experienced it, is a question that the evidence does not yet definitively answer. What the evidence does definitively show is this: the consistent, cross-cultural testimony of ancient civilizations points at something that happened, something real, something significant, something that left marks in the stone and the mathematics and the mythology of every major culture that has ever existed, something that transmitted knowledge, mathematical, astronomical, agricultural, architectural, to multiple civilizations simultaneously, across distances and barriers that should have made such transmission impossible. The messages from the stars, if that is what they are, were not sent in radio waves to a telescope in Ohio. They were encoded in the proportions of buildings, in the alignment of stones, in the oral traditions of cultures that understood something about the cosmos that we are only now beginning to verify with our own telescopes and particle accelerators and quantum computers. The wow signal lasted 72 seconds. It has not been repeated. Perhaps it did not need to be repeated. Perhaps the message was already here, already encoded, already waiting in the desert and the mathematics and the mythology for a civilization sophisticated enough to read it. We are possibly approaching that level of sophistication now. The question is whether we are willing to look at what the message actually says, without deciding in advance that the answer must fit inside the history we have already written. New dark history every week on Grimvale Epoch. Subscribe so you never miss the next story that the official record tried to leave behind. The buried do not always stay buried, and some messages were always meant to be found.